And today we have the pleasure, CREES, CPPS, CES, the Center for European Studies, and the Franco Center for Judaic Studies, to co-sponsor a talk by Michael Meng, who's assistant professor at Clemson University. Before I introduce him more formally, I wanted, however, to just point here to a series of events that we have here and to announce our next CREES lecture, which will happen on a Tuesday afternoon, so it's not our usual time slot, October 21st. Catherine Verdery is coming back to Michigan to give a talk on an anthropology of Romania's secret police. So I invite you to come, mark your calendar. It's going to be a fabulous event. And today I have the pleasure to host Michael Meng, who's the author of Shattered Spaces, Encountering Jewish Ruins in Post-War Germany and Poland, which is a fabulous book published, I think, 2012, right? 2011 by Harvard University Press, and which received several awards. So it won a Best Book Award by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies from Notre Dame. It won also an award from the Central European History Society. It was a finalist from Yad Vashem International Book Prize, and also a finalist from the Wiener Library in London. It's a fabulous book that compares the treatment of Jewish ruins after World War II in East Germany, West Germany, and Poland from the afterwar period up to the present. So it's really a tour de force. It's really difficult to do that kind of research. And today, Michael will be speaking to us on Enlightened Memory, on remembering the Jewish past in contemporary Germany and Poland. Thank you very much. So,
well, thank you very much for the introduction, and above all, thank you very much for inviting me here. This is my first time in Ann Arbor, my first time actually in Michigan, outside of Detroit, that is the airport. So, and I only wish I had more time, but somehow I got sacked with an 8 a.m. class. So tomorrow morning I teach at 8 a.m. And then I teach my seminar in the late afternoon. So I have to go back tonight and then teach tomorrow. So I wish I had a little more time, but I don't. But I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming at this hour to spend some time to think about Poland and Germany and the issue of memory. What I've prepared today, the text I've written is, I guess I would say it's an interdisciplinary text, that is, in the sense that it blends intellectual and cultural history with a kind of philosophical reflection. And so the question that I've been interested in, and I'm going to explain in the beginning of the text, is why communities remember. And so the example is going to be Germany and Poland, but I think, as you'll see how I start, that this is a question that we can ask, and I hope in our discussion, because I've kept the text pretty, relatively short, so I think I won't talk much more than about 35 minutes, so we have a lot of time for discussion, that this is a question that one can ask for practically any community. So I hope that the particular examples of Germany and Poland will raise thoughts and questions that we can then apply, as I understand many people in the room, to other areas of the world, including to the one that we're in right now, that is Ann Arbor, or the United States more broadly. So let me begin. The title, Enlightened Memory, is trying to think about the hopes and paradoxes of memory in contemporary Central Europe, with a specific focus on the two countries that I know best, Germany and Poland. Since I completed my book on memories of the pre-war Jewish past in Germany and Poland 3 years ago, I've been interested in thinking about a philosophical question through the historical context of contemporary Central Europe. This question has been this: what seems to be at stake in collectively remembering past episodes of violence in the public sphere? Why should societies talk about and remember their dark pasts? This question has perplexed me for some time now for a couple of reasons. One reason is how my book ended, with segments of German and Polish society critically reflecting on the Holocaust and the complex and different ways in which their respective societies responded to or participated in the Nazi genocide of the Jews. This relatively recent turn towards self-critical discussion about the past, an effort initiated predominantly by activists on the left, and thus by no means uncontested in both countries, strikes me as perplexing. Or, put more prudently, it strikes me as unconventional. It seems unconventional to me as someone who grew up in and teaches in the American South. If Faulkner might be right that the past isn't dead, a great deal of detail hinges on which past a community decides to recollect and how it wishes to recollect it. The kind of searching discussions about past violence that have been unfolding in contemporary Germany and Poland tend to occur less frequently and less intensely in the American South in regards to its clearly different, yet also very painful and dark history of violence and racism. Only this year is my university beginning to engage in a university-wide discussion about its racial past, a past that has long been forgotten at Clemson in particular, and in the South in general, perhaps most often by what Freud calls negation. The histories of slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow have appeared only for their significance to be diminished by characteristically optimistic American narratives about progress, freedom, and emancipation. Now, as with any simplification, these remarks can only be taken so far, to be sure. Yet the silences about violence and racism that generally tend to define the intellectual, cultural, and political landscape of the American South represent, in my mind, the conventional reaction of societies to their dark past. In this sense, the examples of contemporary Germany and Poland appear to deviate, at least somewhat, from the common pattern of silence and forgetting. Put more precisely, contemporary Germany and Poland may be seen as less conventional insofar as both countries have a visible number of what I might call memory activists present in their societies. These memory activists are Poles and Germans who believe that remembering the dark aspects of their national histories in the public sphere is important, and who therefore strive to provoke critical, thoughtful discussions about the past with the hope that remembrance will strengthen democracy. In short, Germany and Poland have in their societies a considerable number of people who view memory as a significant form of democratic enlightenment. In this talk, I would like to focus on a few of these memory activists. In particular, I would like to consider what seems to be at stake in their activism. Why do some Poles and Germans insist on remembering dark and painful periods of their history? Of course, many answers to this question come to mind. Ethical obligations to ensure that catastrophic events not be forgotten, or theological commands to absolve sin through admissions of guilt, or the pursuit of emotional catharsis through historical truth-telling. But there is one answer that I'd like to explore this afternoon, namely the hopeful belief in the liberating power of education, the hope that Holocaust memory can produce the enlightened knowledge necessary for present and future democratic citizens, particularly to refute contemporary and future forms of ethno-cultural nationalism and other types of social exclusion. The hope is that Holocaust memory will educate and ultimately transform Germans and Poles into citizens who will prioritize an egalitarian, universalistic identity of democratic citizenship over an exclusive ethno-cultural identity of national belonging. This hope invested in collective memory, as Michael Geyer has astutely noted, is predicated on the assumption that public discussions about the Holocaust will have, quote, a cathartic effect by combating radical evil with enlightened knowledge, end quote. In other words, this hope rests on the presupposition that remembrance is transformative and good. It rests on a positive evaluation of remembrance that has deep roots in the European philosophical tradition, going back to the ancient period and to one of the earliest thinkers of education and education's role in the polis, that is, Plato. In a number of Plato's dialogues, Socrates suggests that education involves recollection. That is to say, education involves the process of calling back into the present what one already knew but hitherto had forgotten. Education liberates one from the chains of ignorance and gradually moves one from the particular to the universal. In contemporary Central Europe, the pedagogical promise of collective memory conceives of remembrance as a liberating form of education. Remembrance in the public sphere aims to cultivate knowledge about the past with the hope that such knowledge will stimulate critiques of ethnocultural nationalism as well as of other historically contingent forms of social exclusion and practice. These critiques of particularism, it is hoped further, will ultimately strengthen the universalistic principles of democracy. I want to explore this democratic hope in enlightened memory in several ways this afternoon. First, I want to lay out in somewhat greater detail the theoretical vision of enlightened memory in the German context, before then turning, second, to a recent example of it in practice in the Polish case. The final section of my talk will consider some of the paradoxes of enlightened memory, hence the question mark in the title. Now, before I begin, let me make one short comment about the status of my parallel reading. In this talk, I happen to be interested largely in similarities rather than differences among the cases of Germany and Poland, because the memory activists I'm drawn to here are engaged, in my view, in the shared project of enlightened memory, despite the many and obvious historical differences that distinguish the respective societies in which they live and labor. One difference, however, remains important. I begin with the West German case simply because it was there that the connection between enlightened memory and liberal democracy was first theorized. However, I want to resist making too much of that difference. By beginning with Germany and then moving to Poland, I do not want to reprise the standard narrative that contemporary Poland is now finally catching up to Germany in regards to remembering the Holocaust, a narrative that you'll see circulated very, very often these days in the New York Times especially. If there's anything I hope my book might have done, would have been to challenge that. So I don't want to reprise that at all. So with that caveat in mind, let me now begin by briefly reconstructing the link between democracy and enlightened memory, a link that was made by several German intellectuals amid the ruination of Nazism. Let me get a little water. Okay, so let's turn to the German case, and then we'll turn to Poland. Collective memory has historically been central to constructing and reprising group identifications. Recently, however, a number of scholars have suggested that the entanglement of memory with one particularly important group in the modern era, namely the national community, seems to be breaking down, or at least weakening amid the processes of European unification and globalization. If this is indeed so, then one might suggest that the aura of national memory began to ebb significantly earlier in the ruins of Germany among a group of German intellectuals who pondered critically the so-called German question. At stake in this question was the need to create new national identities after Nazism, specifically democratic identities that would negate and replace the nationalistic myths through which Nazism asserted its violent politics of particularity. This effort to engage critically with Nazism began very early indeed. On May 29, 1945, Thomas Mann delivered a searching lecture into the origins of Nazism at the Library of Congress. After recalling the provincial world of his childhood in Lübeck, Mann settled on the themes of romanticism, inwardness, and illiberalism, on the sensuous musical German soul that feels close to the irrational forces of life and finds evil erotically appealing. Mann offered one of the first pieces of German self-criticism in the hope that perhaps a better Germany might emerge from the ruins of Nazism. A few years later, albeit in a much darker and longer piece, he reflected on the radical evil and catastrophe of Nazism in Dr. Faustus. If Mann may have been one of the first self-critical voices on the German question, he was, of course, hardly the only one. In 1959, Theodor Adorno offered his well-known critique of West German attempts to work through the past, while at the same time insisting on the importance of, quote, a pedagogy that promotes enlightenment. Like Mann, Adorno cautiously nourished the possibility that reflection and remembrance may be able to provoke critical engagement with German nationalistic traditions. It was, though, above all, Jürgen Habermas who most thoroughly sketched out the importance of remembrance to Germany's democratization. He turned Adorno's cautious affirmation of democratic remembrance into a positive pedagogy of enlightened knowledge. Shaped both by a long-standing concern about the support of German intellectuals for Nazism, above all Martin Heidegger, and by the intense political conflicts that erupted over German history during the 1980s in particular, Habermas has sought over the past 2 decades to advance in German society what we might call a post-national or cosmopolitan memory culture centered on critical reflection on the Holocaust. Putting the matter very briefly and generally, Habermas supports a Kantian-inflected cosmopolitanism that is committed to supranational institutions such as the European Union, legal norms such as human rights, the expansion of civic solidarities across nation-states, and the development of a post-national memory culture. The last component of Habermas's cosmopolitanism represents a particularly original insight. Habermas believes that a critical memory culture ideally will negate traditional national identities and supplant them with liberal democratic commitments. As a form of education, enlightened memory will move citizens from the particular to the universal. Vigorous debates about the past and the emergence of a public culture of remembering the Holocaust will ideally orient Germans away from ethnocultural nationalism and towards the universalistic norms and procedures of the democratic constitutional state. Holocaust memory will perpetually critique the past traditions that engendered Nazism, functioning as a kind of guard against the reappearance of illiberalism and ethnocultural nationalism, the central historical causes of Nazism for Habermas and his understanding of German history. As he put it, quote, the commemoration of Auschwitz performs a kind of monitoring function that demands that traditions be tested, because after Auschwitz, national self-confidence can only be derived from the better traditions of our history, which we no longer simply take for granted, but appropriate in a critical fashion, end quote. Habermas has carved out here an ambitious role for collective memory, in Germany in particular, and in democratic national states more broadly. The boldness of his position might be worth appreciating for a moment. Habermas attempts to address one of the central paradoxes of liberal democracy since the French and American revolutions. While liberal democracies rest on the principles of equal rights and citizenship, in practice the scope of democratic rights and citizenship have historically been delimited by the politics, identities, and prejudices of national communities. The particular containers of democracy since the late 18th century, when national independence and democracy became conjoined. The universality of democratic principles hinges on the policies of the nation-state, or more precisely, it hinges on how democratically inclusive the national polis is imagined to be. Habermas wishes to address this paradox in a substantial and I think interesting way by making a post-national, self-critical memory culture the content of national identity. If national communities imagine themselves self-critically around past failures of civic solidarity and egalitarianism, he seems to believe that they may come to embrace history as a kind of what he calls critical teacher, as an authority that insists on constitutional patriotism as the only form of national identification after the mass violence of the 20th century. In sum, Habermas's vision of enlightened memory turns on the crucial relationship of remembrance to the politics and histories of the nation-state. Collective memories of the nation-state in the public sphere can neither be heroic nor prideful, in his view. Rather, public remembrance must be self-critical, introspective, and take on the pedagogical purpose of enlightenment. As Habermas writes, in a long quote that I'll read, "For the nations that dragged the planet into a technologically unlimited war in 1914, and for the people who were forced to confront the mass crimes of an ideologically unlimited war of extermination after 1939, the year 1945 also marks a turning point, a turn towards something better, toward the mastering of the force of barbarism that had broken through the very foundations of civilization in Germany. Should we not have learned something from the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century?" Let us fill out some of these points a bit further by turning to the case of Poland, contemporary Poland in particular. Poland, with its distinctive history and demographics, has been faced since 1989, once again, with the question of who Poles are as a nation in a new global order. Remembering the Jewish past and the rupture of the Holocaust can be modes for imagining a more pluralistic Poland, and for some, an open, cosmopolitan Polish identity. Just as in Germany, some leftist memory activists in Poland imbue memory with pedagogical and political purpose. Some are engaged in efforts to view Polish history self-critically in an attempt to strengthen civic solidarity, egalitarianism, and universalistic imaginations of national belonging. But narrating Jewish experience from a Polish perspective, that is, from the particular perspectives I'm talking about here of these leftist memory activists, namely, is not defined by loss or lack, or a need of catching up to the West with its established modes of Holocaust memory. Poland is working through and contributing to Holocaust memory anew, shining a particular light on the intimate relations of victims, perpetrators, and witnesses that was the reality in these bloodlands of face-to-face as well as industrialized killing. Take as an example one of the most recent and, I think, interesting memory projects in Poland. Probably many of you have heard about it or have seen it. It is the project designed by Berlin-based Israeli Jewish artist Yael Bartana and carried out in collaboration with Sławomir Sierakowski, a well-known Polish intellectual and leftist political activist. This transnational project reflects on the absence of Polish Jews in very experimental ways and intervenes in German, Polish, and Jewish memories of the Holocaust to critique nationalism and foster transnational solidarities among human beings. Bartana's And Europe Will Be Stunned, the name of the project, is a trilogy of short films shot in Warsaw from 2007 to 2011. The films chronicle the quote-unquote fictional Jewish Renaissance movement in Poland, a vibrant youth-based political campaign that has called on 3.3 million Jews to return to Poland. The first film, Nightmares, which was filmed in 2007, features the movement's leader, performed by Sierakowski, pleading for Jews to return to Poland, He longs for Jews and wants them back, unsettling the cliched image of the anti-Semitic Pole as construed in such films as Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, while underlining the ambivalent role of nostalgia in such progressive Polish approaches to remembering their country's Jewish past. Bartana's project dares to envision, however fantastically, Poland as a center of future Jewish life. Where did I go? There we go. Building on a deep reservoir of largely repressed yearnings for the quote-unquote vanished world of East European Jewry that exist on both the Polish and Jewish sides of the equation. Indeed, provocatively underscoring the intersections of vision and reality, the Jewish Renaissance movement in Poland has a website, a manifesto, and held even a congress in Berlin in May of 2012. Bartana's idea for the project originated during an emotionally jarring visit that she took to Poland in 2006. At first, she thoroughly disliked Poland. "I found the prejudice against Jews to be very strong there," she said. "It was anti-Semitism at its finest, as well as anti-gay, anti-everything that I am," end quote. But over time, she grew attracted to Poland. Earnestly, what's even more strange and interesting is that Poland is the only European country in which I felt a strong connection to the place without even understanding why, end quote. As she explained further, her connection may not have been to Poland per se, than to the memory of pre-war Jewish life in Poland, an absence she strongly experienced and felt during a trip to former Polish Jewish towns. In the end, her trip to Poland inspired Bartana to imagine a project that would critique nationalistic politics in all forms. Stylized as a propaganda film, her trilogy creates a medley of images, styles, and motifs from the past. Zionist iconography of strong Jews, Leni Riefenstahl's camera work, Stalinist architecture, Holocaust images of barbed wire, all of these channeled toward rejecting political utopianism in the form of nationalism and embracing it in the form of cosmopolitanism. While the project envisions itself as transnational, one may nevertheless see as nested within it different national parts. In particular, a distinctly Polish conversation about the past and national identity structures the content of the first film. The film opens with Sierakowski, dressed in a black leather trench coat, white shirt, and red tie, walking through a tunnel, down a running track, onto a grassy field, and up the stairs of a small black wooden pedestal. The setting, the film announces, is Warsaw's quote-unquote Olympic Stadium. Built in 1955 by the communist state and very recently demolished, the stadium stands as a ruin in the film, with vegetation covering its weathered stones. Sierakowski reaches his lectern and proclaims, "Jews, fellow countrymen, people, you think the old woman who still sleeps under Rivka's quilt doesn't want to see you?" Rivka in the trilogy is a Jewish ghost. "Do you think she has forgotten about you? You're wrong. She dreams about you every night, dreams and trembles with fear. Since the night you were gone and her mother reached for your quilt, she has had nightmares, bad dreams. Only you can chase them away. Let the 3 million Jews that Poland has missed stand by her bed and finally chase away the demons. Return to Poland, to our country. This is a call, not to the dead, but to the living. We want 3 million Jews to return to Poland. We want you to live with us again. We need you." Sierakowski goes on to critique anti-Semitism, ethnocultural prejudice, and messianic Polish nationalism before returning to his argument that Poland needs Jews to redeem its sins. As he speaks, a group of young devotees, clad in communist-style scout uniforms, write on the field the following phrase, quote, 3.3 million Jews can change the life of 40 million Poles. Shortly afterwards, Bartana cuts to an aerial shot of stone pillars in what remains of the stadium's bleachers. The camera stays on this image for about 7 seconds. With the screen darkened and somewhat blurred, the pillars look like tombstones. The film shifts between juxtaposing images of ruination and rebirth. The speech itself is replete with historic references, images, and idioms. The wartime seizure of Jewish goods, objects, and property, the murder of Jews during the Holocaust, the post-war immigration of Jews from Poland, the psychoanalytic command to work through nightmares, and nationalistic narratives of Polish and Jewish suffering. The speech also plays with redemptive narratives. The return of Jews to Poland promises to heal the tensions between Jews and Poles, who, when they see each other, will finally allow the armor to fall. Redemption from past sins will bring history to an end, ushering in a post-historical moment of cosmopolitan togetherness. Poles and Jews will lose their particular affiliations and identifications as chosen peoples and become Europeans. How might we read this speech? On the one hand, we might read it as clearly playful. It overtly mocks the utopianism of nationalism, fascism, communism, and Enlightened memory. Szyrakowski performs as a clownish disciple whose histrionics subvert the faith and whose exaggerated parody of messianic Polish nationalism staves off any notion of salvation, any prospect of hope. On the other hand, Szyrakowski and Bartana appear quite serious about provoking discussions about the past to address political questions about exclusion, discrimination, and persecution in the present future. Perhaps their project embraces a kind of Socratic irony that seeks to stimulate dialogue about dark pasts in order to advance more tolerant and open societies. As a leader of political critique, which characterizes itself as a leftist milieu or movement, Szyrakowski seems to want Poles to engage in a discussion about the idea of 3 million Jews returning to their country. He wishes to unsettle the mythologies of Polish nationalism in the hope of securing stronger civic, democratic, and post-national commitments in Poland. He subverts the faith in emancipatory memory only to reinforce it. In other words, if we read his irony as ultimately reinforcing the importance of self-criticism and cosmopolitanism, we come back to a Habermasian vision of memory as a pedagogical project of enlightened knowledge that seeks to orient citizens towards post-national identifications and democratic commitments. This return to Habermas brings me to the final section of my talk. So far, I've attempted merely to outline generally the pedagogical purpose invested in memory among some leftist intellectuals and activists in contemporary Germany and Poland. To conclude, I would like to turn briefly to a question that has been on my mind for some time now, and that has also been on the minds of others, including a number of people here today, from whose work I have learned a great deal. The question is perhaps the obvious one. Has enlightened memory reached its ambitious aim of transforming politics and thinking in Central Europe? Has memory engendered the more self-critical and democratic societies it strives to produce? Of course, these questions are almost impossible to answer. How precisely might we judge the quote-unquote success of something as nebulous and complex as collective memory? Rather than thinking in terms of success, I propose thinking in terms of a paradox. Over the past decade, the region of Central Europe has experienced, and I think this might be especially the case in Germany, especially over the last 5 months, a notable rise in anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia, especially the latter, that is, against migrants and Muslims in the German case. This increase comes when knowledge and memory about the Holocaust has been greater than at any other period in post-1945 Central European history. As Michael Geyer puts the paradox, quote, "It was and is the firm belief of the politics of memory that the past will not be repeated, if only people remember. But as a politics and culture of memory grew in the 1970s and 1980s, so did a politics and culture of anti-Semitism and racism, as well as desperate and terrorist identity politics These were the first indications that there was something wrong with the original argument. End quote. What seems to have gone wrong? Perhaps the most obvious answer is that the Project Enlightened Memory has not reached deeply into German and Polish society. Conventional narratives about the nation-state have in fact remained quite durable. As we know from a number of recent publications on collective memory in Germany and Poland, from many scholars here at Michigan in particular, traditional narratives about victimization resistance still strongly shape the ways in which Germans and Poles interpret their national histories. A significant disconnect seems to exist between the pedagogical hopes of enlightened memory and the enduring appeal, popular appeal, of conventional national memories and myths. Moreover, public forms of Holocaust memory have to a significant extent been sublimated into traditional redemptive narratives and discourses about guilt, penance, and purification. In the public sphere, remembering the Holocaust has frequently been presented as a practice of purifying the nation of its sins. This redemptive narration of Holocaust memory is especially strong in contemporary Germany. While in Poland, and this is in my view, and there's a lot of Polish specialists, so I'll be interested in what you guys think as well. While in Poland, it seems to me, projects to remember the Holocaust still seem to provoke intense emotions and still seem to critique standard historical narratives. In contemporary Germany, Holocaust memory appears to have lost much of the political and emotive edge that it once had in the 1970s and 1980s. Germany's many iterations of Holocaust memory seem to function today more as cathartic markers of the country's successful transformation into a tolerant democratic society than as efforts to reflect critically on the country's past and present. This sense of achieved tolerance and accomplishment, as Wendy Brown has suggested in another context, may in fact be contributing to the current unawareness that some Germans seem to have about the presence of racism, anti-Semitism, and exclusion in their society today. Poles will likely face similar challenges at some point in the future. And so we might ask, can enlightened memory projects maintain their political edge and didactic purpose? If so, how? Finally, I want to gesture very briefly at two additional paradoxes within the project of enlightened memory that may further help in understanding its contemporary limits. The first paradox. For the benefit of what envisioned collective is a given memory project pursued? Cultural, historical, ethnic essentialism can underpin and thus limit self-critical memory projects. If aimed at enlightening a preconceived ethno-national body, memory can exclude citizens or other residents of the nation. Even if Jews in Germany and Poland are incorporated in some manner into the national vision being imagined in a given memory project, others, such as migrants or other minorities, may be cast as external to the collective that memory is being employed to reform and educate. Or at minimum, such groups' different histories and subjectivities may be diminished or denied. Indeed, to return to Habermas for a very brief moment, Holocaust memory is intended to address a strikingly narrow audience in his view. During the debate about Berlin's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, he wrote, quote, "The circle of authors who could desire such a memorial closes. Neither Jewish Germans, nor the Sinti and Roma who reside in Germany, nor the immigrants who have become nationalized since the end of World War II can say what this memorial should express. The authors are those citizens who are the direct heirs of a culture in which that was possible," that he means Auschwitz, "who belong to a network of traditions that connects them with the perpetrator generation," end quote. So if the educational purpose of memory for Habermas involves moving from the particular to the universal, Here he unwittingly particularizes the universal. Holocaust memory is directed at reforming the German national community, which he delimits in cultural historical terms. The second paradox I want to raise is, I think, related to or builds on this first one, and it's this. While memory may flow in multiple directions, as Michael Rothberg has suggested in his very stimulating book on multidirectional memory, it may also remain focused on a narrow set of histories and political issues, such as Nazism and combating anti-Semitism, to the exclusion of reflecting on other histories of mass violence in European history, such as colonialism and critiquing other forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination in contemporary European societies, directed against homosexuals, migrants, women, and Muslims, among others. Now, these are substantial paradoxes, and notwithstanding them, and perhaps other paradoxes or tensions that may emerge from our discussion, I would nevertheless like to end by suggesting that the pedagogical intention of enlightened memory is worth defending. The conversations about race currently taking place at my university strike me as potentially meaningful, not least because they may help to uncover the historically contingent practices and ideas of race thinking in one place in the South. Reflections on the past can help unsettle the dominance of conventional narratives, national memories, and exclusionary practices. Discussions about painful periods of history can contribute to challenging the cliches upon which conventional thinking thrives, and more broadly, they can contribute to discussions about who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have time for Q&A. So, just one second. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and asking brief questions.
Let me get a little pen.
My name is Pietro Shakarian, and I'm a student, a Crease master's student at the University of Michigan. And I was just wondering, what are your experiences with, this collective memory with regard to not just Poland and Germany, but also other places where the Holocaust occurred, like in Ukraine, Belarus. Do you have any knowledge of this?
Well, let me see how to answer that. I mean, I guess I would say that, in my view, when we think of Europe, and Josh is in the room too as a French historian, it seems to me, I'm making a very big generalization here, but it seems to me that there are three countries in which you have what I guess I would say are these memory activists. And that's in France, Germany, and Poland. I don't know Ukrainian, I don't know Russian, so I'm a little hesitant to comment on those cases without really deeply thinking about them. But my sense is that it is emerging in Belarus. I mean, there's someone that's working on this, Magdalena Veligorska, is working on the case of Belarus, and she is finding that there are these kind of memory activists, but I think the networks and the institutions and the funding and the support in a place like Belarus is much more limited. I think that's probably the case also in Ukraine, but I think there's also, for instance, there's an urban studies center in Ukraine that I think is doing some very interesting work on the Holocaust and urban culture. So I think it's beginning to emerge, but my sense of it, and again, there's a lot of people in the room who work on this, and so I invite you guys to disagree with me. But my sense is that I think it's even most vigorous in Germany and Poland. I think it's also very substantial in France. But I think, we were just talking before the lecture. I mean, right now in Poland, there's not a day that goes, it's overwhelming to work on this topic in Poland. Because there's not a day that goes by in which there is not something going on in Poland. Right now, Poland is at the center of it, I think. It's actually, Germany's kind of eclipsed. It's kind of peaked, I guess is the better way to put it. And Poland is eclipsing Germany at the moment. So there is tremendous energy in Poland, not least because you have in 2 weeks, October 28th, I think 29th, is it? The opening of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. So that is going to be, I think, a really strong center there in Poland. But I don't know. I know I'm not answering your question very well because I just don't know the other East European cases. But I think it's probably safe enough to say that maybe in 10 or 15 years you'll have something very similar in Ukraine and Belarus. I think it's starting, but I don't think it's quite. I don't think you don't have the kind of dynamicism and the emotion, right? The emotion that is there in Poland that's not there in Germany. I mean, I think in Germany it's become cliche. It's become passé. It had that in the 70s and 80s. Like, I'm an historian, so the book is based on archival, and you could feel what's happening right now in Poland. You could feel that in the West German and to some extent the East German case during the 70s and 80s. But now it's really become very rote. It's become very cliche with very clear markers. I mean, Angela Merkel had a defense against anti-Semitism in September. 5,000 people showed up. In 2000, Gerhard Schröder did the same thing, and 200,000 people showed up. So I think there's something happened in the case of Germany in which you see this. And so that's a long-winded answer to sort of answer your question. Yeah.
Is that a follow-up, Josh?
No, just put me in the queue.
Okay.
I'm Andrew Court. I teach German history at Wayne State University.
Ah,
Also
nice to
the
see you.
Yeah. I'm also the editor of Central European History. This is exactly the type of stuff, comparative stuff that I'm very much interested in. But my question is, listening to your talk, it reminds me of another paradox.
Yeah.
That is, couldn't you argue that it's this enlightened memory agenda in Germany that has, in a sense, led to and created this backlash that we've seen? And what I mean by that, and I'll keep this very short, whether or not what went on in Germany in the last few months was anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, I mean, it seems to me that the way in which the Germans have conducted this debate over the last 25, 30 years, portraying the Jews as victims, and rightfully so, and I'm very glad there's been this debate that the Germans finally rediscovered the Holocaust in the 1970s. I wonder if the way in which it's been done by people like Habermas with the finger wagging, if that explains the backlash today among young Germans who think, well, you talk about our past, what about what the Israelis are doing right now?
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I think it's a really interesting point. And I think what it gets at is, I mean, you say finger wagging, and I think that's a very interesting, because I mean, that's one of the titles of his article, right? It gets to basically a certain dogmatism, right? I mean, Habermas falls into, I think, a real problem insofar as, he's trying to connect. I admire him in a certain way, as it's clear, I think, from the text. I admire him in a certain way that he's trying to carve out a really difficult position, right? Here he is, after the war, he doesn't call himself a philosopher, but I think he's basically a philosopher, trying to deal with the German tradition, trying to create some kind of new Germany. He thinks that in order to do that, you need multiple levels for this reconstruction, and one of them has to be memory. But it turns out that he then basically has to demand that you follow me. You basically have to follow this opinion. You follow this idea, follow this memory. And I think you're right that in a certain sense, ironically, from the younger generation, from the students who, at least in the traditional, conventional narrative, are the ones who bring this up in the 60s, are now to a certain extent. And I think there's a number, I didn't present this exact paper, but I presented a somewhat similar paper to a number of German scholars, and they had very similar reactions. They said that the fourth generation especially seems to be very disinterested in this. And it might be, I think, as you're saying, that it was basically sort of, I guess you might say, forced upon them. But then the bigger dilemma is, well, what do you do? That's what I don't have the answer to that. I'm sort of working through it. The conclusion of the text is like, I don't want to give up, but I see the problem. So thanks for bringing that up. I think it's also a very significant paradox. This sort of it's basically the position of teacher versus student. Habermas is sort of the big teacher telling, the national community of students, this is how you ought to think. And it creates a very significant dilemma, not least of all in a democracy. Does that sort of answer? Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, for really trying to talk. You did such a nice job of laying out in a very concise way the arc of these discussions over the past couple decades. I want to maybe call into question a little bit that concision, because it seems to me
that by characterizing enlightened memory as a distinct project and associating it closely with one thing in particular, Habermas, you might actually be smoothing over some of the complicating factors that always made this project problematic.
Yeah.
And I say this speaking as a French historian where the debates are obviously somewhat different and there is no figure like Habermas who do the same thing. But I just want to suggest that certain moments, whether it be the 60s or the 80s, of struggling to come up with a posture of critical reflection are often not projects, but actually very contingent discussions in which there are a lot of groups participating whose interests are not at all universal. That is, when they have very particularist reasons for wanting to engage in critical reflection about memory. That's one. So, like in Algerian war veterans, or the Chat Noir, or the Harki in France, very particularist concerns. And second of all, that the very and then at moments when they actually are thinking about the universal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That those definitions of the universal are themselves being impinged upon for all sorts of contingent reasons, like, say, the association of universalism in France with the empire itself, or alternatively, the financial pressures of the welfare state, which are demanding that the state decide which populations are going to be better served by public funds, et cetera. All these things are impinging. So I'll stop there. But in other words, I think that a lot of the debates about the past are also very much present-based political.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I guess two comments. One thing, the thing that you single out is there's really no other figure like Habermas in any European country, right? Which makes it interesting for me, at least, as a cultural and intellectual story. That it seems to me, he's really the first one after the war that, Adorno is his inspiration, so it's there in Adorno, but Adorno is much more pessimistic. So Habermas is an eternally optimistic man. It's incredible optimism in Habermas, and so he's interested in that respect. Now, to the second point, though, that's just a comment on your small little point that you made. I think you're absolutely right about the political and that it's shaping these debates without a doubt. I went over it way too quickly in the talk, but it's coming out of the for Habermas in particular, it's coming out of the 1980s. In the Polish case, it's also a very deeply political debate about what kind of nation state this is going to be. And I think, the Habermasian, Sherikowski, the leftist position is that the only identity we can really have has got to be basically a civic democratic one. That's the only way that we can possibly bring everyone into the tent. Otherwise, you're always going to leave someone out. Now, the problem, though, as I try to outline at the end, is that, the problem basically still is that you're dealing with a nation state. You're dealing with the container. And, the memory projects, ironically, end up being basically speaking to and expressed for non-Jewish Germans and Poles. And in the German case, because Germany has now a very significant migrant population, about 20% of Germany's population has some kind of migrant background now. It's also a non-migrant German. It's explicit in Habermas, and he hasn't returned to it, which is interesting. He's returned to a lot of things recently, particularly the issue of Muslims, and he's been very, very strong defender of Muslims in Germany. But he hasn't returned to the Holocaust stuff since the early 90s, which is interesting. I guess it goes back to the fact that Poland is now, I think Poland is really the place for Holocaust, for these kind of discussions. And maybe Poland will try to work it out as well. But I think you're absolutely right that it's embedded in a politics of the present. It's a deeply political competition between the right and the left, and it's therefore deeply influenced by the particularities of those political conflicts. Yet theoretically wanting to transcend them. Yeah.
Are you okay? So I have Anna, Lee, Herb, and Brian. So.
Yeah, you can stand and this microphone doesn't travel. I'd give it to you otherwise.
So I have a very quick question on Poland and a comment on Ukraine.
Yeah.
Saying that here in this audience, I'm sure there are a lot of people who know much more than I do. But my first question on Poland is I was interested and surprised that you were talking only about leftist activists in case of Poland, because there is a substantial
Yeah,
state,
sure.
involvement in trying to bring those discussions about Polish involvement in the Holocaust to the public. Starting with 2000, I mean, IPN and most historians are very critical of a lot of work that IPN is doing, but in 2000, the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland actually organized a survey of Polish textbooks just to see how many of them are discussing the case of Yadwabne. And in 2000, and this is 2000, it's 14 years ago. So
Mhm.
this is the moment when really the Pandora box of Jan Gross's neighbors was like slowly entering, all these spheres of public
Mhm.
zones. And in 2000, out of 20 books, there were 4 of them. There were only 4, actually only 6 of them that were mentioning Yadwabne. And the plan back then in 2000 was to actually change it. So occasionally from
Yeah.
2000, there are surveys of Polish textbooks delivered to elementary schools in Poland just to see how this issue is discussed. I don't know any recent, no recent numbers. As far as Ukraine, I mean, Lviv is building its
Mhm.
first memorial to pogrom of 1941 with the help of the
Yeah. Yeah.
urban center. The city, it's called the urban center.
Yeah, the Center for Urban History. Yeah. Yeah.
And they actually bring in a number of historians, both Ukrainian, Eastern European, American scholars to talk about the Ukrainian engagement in the Holocaust. At the same time, I would say that Ukraine is very conflicted, and Lviv isn't conflicted. The rest of Ukraine is probably more conflicted because the local prison where the first phase of the 1941 pogrom actually took place is completely denying the role of any participation of Ukraine in the Holocaust
Mhm.
in its most recent exhibition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for it. Well, the easy answer why I didn't talk about the others is that I just wanted to narrow it down, the talk. So that's the simple answer. And I guess there's also a more, I suppose, sophisticated answer there. And that is, I think the story of not wanting to remember the Holocaust in Poland especially is a fairly well-known story. And so I kind of wanted to say something a little that would be slightly, well, I wanted to narrow it down, but I also wanted to try to tell a different story that I think is significant. Nevertheless, I mean, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. In my book, I deal much more. I mean, I don't deal just with leftists in my book, right? You're absolutely right. It's a conflict. I mean, right now, Poland is going through this a very emotional political confrontation between, basically, if you wanted to simplify it, between right and the left over the past. And I think it centers on basically whether or not, and of course you also had this in Germany in the 80s. I think it's less so right now in Germany, but well, let me think about it as I talk. But in Poland, let's stick with Poland for a second. You have, I think the conflict centers over basically what kind of narrative do we want? Do we want to stick to the conventional heroic narrative of resistance, of which there is material for it? I mean, we can't deny that there's significant resistance, for example, against the Nazis by Poles. So there's not like, it's not like there's not material that this is just a myth. I mean, it is an important part of Polish history. But do we turn that into the only thing that we remember, which tends to be the conservative position, that is that this is a heroic history of resistance? Or do we want to try to stimulate a more critical understanding of our past? And it's very, very conflict-ridden. I was at a conference that Jan Gross organized. Jan Gross, the author of Yadwabne, the book that came out in 2000 in Polish and then 2001 in English, about a pogrom in the small city of town of Yadwabne in eastern Poland in 1941, just as the Nazis are invading the Soviet Union. In this small town in Yadwabne, he discovered, Jan Gross, a sociologist who now teaches at Princeton, discovered that the non-Jewish Polish population participated in a pogrom, and there were other cases. So he's the author of this book that then stimulated this enormous discussion. He held a conference at Princeton 2 years ago, and the Consulate General of New York sent an emissary to the conference to denounce us, scholars. So, I mean, I have experienced it quite literally. I'm very well aware of. And this was approved by the foreign minister. So it went all the way to Warsaw, right? It was approved, the letter. I have the letter in my house. So I can show it to you. But we then wrote a response. Chris Browning actually was there, and he was the one who drafted the response, and Jan Gross, and we all signed it, right? Because we felt the conference was to, this is also going to the point, the conference was to introduce to the United States the tremendous amount of research that's being done on the Holocaust in Warsaw, led by Barbara Engelking. So she was there, and a bunch of Polish scholars. So we felt that we needed to write something, because we felt that they couldn't necessarily have responded, and so we did. And then the consulate wrote back and said, "You misinterpreted us." But I mean, it was a fiery letter. It said, and remember, they had not heard one single paper. They were just going on the titles. Said, "You are denouncing and defaming the glory of the Polish nation." So yes, you have this. I mean, yeah, of course. Which makes it, it's very raw. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, a talk only talks about one group, but there's multiple groups that are at play at this. Yeah.
I think Lee was first. And please be short, both in the questions and perhaps in the answers. If you want
Sorry.
the last
Sorry.
round.
Sorry.
You have the floor.
One point, put it for a long time on it.
Do we end at 1:15?
Please don't. 1:30.
Oh, we have.
I guess the question,
Yeah.
if I really want to make it sharp, is where do you find irony in Habermas or his project?
There is no irony. Yeah.
There's no irony.
Not in
So-
Habermas. No.
But I've heard you link Habermas to Adorno, where there's a
Mm.
completely different dialectical form of argument,
Yeah.
not a more linear enlightenment.
Right,
reason,
sure.
As well as Yarkowski, where the Polish pedagogy is a pedagogy of irony.
Mm.
So when you're answering a colleague's question of Habermas being up there as an authoritarian figure, to defend him, he's not seeing himself that way. That's reason speaking.
Mm.
And your optimism at the end on the Clemson case is, reason's going to set us free again.
Mm.
But isn't this the problem?
Reason?
A certain with
Yeah.
a certain kind of memory that can't allow for all kinds of other forces, even the emotionalism, that irony, other rhetorical devices. And isn't this the total narrowness of Habermas's universalism, that it's coming out of a very particular part of European history and he cannot, even as Adorno might, encompass the more complex nature of our history, and that then gets into the more problems of contingency
Yeah.
and circumstance.
Yeah. Let me think. Well, the extent to the extent that Habermas is influenced by Adorno, I think rests on the fundamental level that Adorno has two very key essays where he says, the first one is about education after Auschwitz, and the second one is his more famous one, Working Through the German Past. What does that mean? And Adorno basically comes down to, we need to remember this, but he's very, very pessimistic about it doing anything. Habermas, of course, was a student and was in the Frankfurt School. I think one of his most significant contributions to post-1945 intellectual life is to try to basically, recover the Enlightenment project, and from the grips of Adorno. And then there's a bigger figure in the German case that they're both after, and that is Heidegger, right? And they want to basically say Heidegger and his attack against rationality must be defended. We have to defend it. So even Adorno defends rationality. I don't think Adorno goes to that extent. Yeah. Well, of course. Yeah, of course. That's the bigger problem. And I have to think about a response to you, honestly. That's a big question that I got to work through. But I appreciate it. I don't know if I would be so optimistic to say that rationality will liberate us. But what do we have then? What do we I know, of course. I end that way. But what do we have then? Do we not talk? Do we not lead these discussions?
Maybe my question maybe picks up on these, although I don't really have the background to frame it the way this is framed. When you started out, it seemed like you were contrasting the situation in the United States with what's going on in Poland and Germany. And I was thinking that indeed in the United States there's also what might be called enlightened memory studies. It also comes from the left, and we have different victims of our imperialism and genocidal activities, Native Americans and blacks. And certainly there's a lot of that comes from the left and has a certain amount of endorsement, but it doesn't necessarily make a big impact. And some of what you said later on is questioning how much impact it made in Germany either. The whole interjection of present issues around migrants. So it seems to me that the battle is being fought between a kind of rational, enlightenment, pedagogical approach to this, and the other side, which is a kind of affectual, emotional appeal of ethno-nationalism linked to self-interest. And I was thinking about the Yugoslav situation as a parallel too. We have different victims of genocide in all of these places, and similar battles being fought with the Enlightenment memory coming from the left and the ethno-nationalism coming from the right. And I think you're right, there's no other way to go but the way the progressive forces are going. But the psychological attractions of this ethno-nationalism combined with self-interest remains a formidable obstacle everywhere. I guess it's a conjecture more than a question.
Let me try to be brief about both. Well, I mean, I agree with you completely on number one. That is that in the United States, there's plenty of self-critical voices. I mean, nevertheless, here I am, 35 years old. I grew up in Florida. I learned German and Polish, and I go over these countries, and I somehow think there is part of it's maybe the smallness of these countries. We have a huge place. I mean, it's a big place. But my experiences in the South, at least, I can't at all speak about this region because I just haven't lived here. But my experience in the South are that there is, I teach, obviously, in the South. And, of course, I have many students of very different backgrounds and diverse, ideas. But there's a strong resistance that you don't quite experience as intensely, I guess.
Done better at burying our crime.
Maybe. The other point I want to just make very briefly is really important, I think. And that goes actually back to, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Lee's point, and that is about the emotion. I mean, the big problem that the Enlightenment, the Enlightened Memory Project has, if we want to call it a project, just be simple about it for a second, is emotion, right? Nation states can mobilize emotion in incredibly powerful ways. As I tell my students, there's very, very few things in the world that you'll be willing to die for. And the nation states won. Will someone be willing to die for, Habermasian rationality? That's I think, one of the big, maybe that's also answering your question a little bit more. So you're absolutely right. You put it very well. I mean, the nation state has emotion. Rationality tries to de-emotionalize things. Though Habermas has an answer. He wants it to be Holocaust memory. It will be that emotion. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the role of the church in both countries. It seems as if maybe that some of these projects are like going to confession.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You just go and you're absolved of your crime.
Yeah.
These memory places might have.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. No, I agree. In my book, I'm much more. This is a more optimistic talk. So, in my book, I talk about this sort of redemptive framing of memory, which is very, very strong, as obviously Christian, and so both of these countries are deeply Christian. Even Germany, which perceives to be the secularized space. There was a poll that came out 2 years ago that 75% of Germans, think of the defining element of their culture as Christianity. So, the Christian narrative of redemption, that you go to penance, and Foucault has written about this in a very interesting way in a recent lecture on truth. And the centrality of the penance narrative is very much clear here, that you go to confession, and then what happens after you confess? You absolve yourself, and it's done. And so I think that plays a big role here. Brian would be the one to have, I hate to throw the ball to him, but he's the one to answer the question on the churches. But I can answer a little bit, but not to put you on the spot. But you also have a question.
Yeah, that's my question. I mean, the answer and the question on the church would, well, actually, you know what, it actually links up with what I was going to ask. Because it strikes me that this project of enlightened memory that you're describing here has a sort of inherent instability that I think we see really played out here precisely in the comparative context that you're bringing up. So Habermas's claim that we want to use the memory of the Holocaust as the site for enlightened memory has a viability, an obvious viability in Germany. As soon as you translate it to Poland, though, you've got a complicating factor in that you're asking essentially victims of the Holocaust to remember their own ambiguous status in that victimhood. And basically you're saying we want to have enlightened memory depends upon discussions of justice in the context of historical memory. Well, the minute you start that conversation in the East European context, the concept of justice means remember the wrongs done to us, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, when you frame this democratic project of enlightened memory in the sort of vessel of historical justice, then you've, I'm searching for the right metaphor, you've opened a Pandora's box that makes your position very unstable and makes that very democratic project that you're seeking very unstable. Tchaikovsky is actually a prime example of how this instability can play out. If you've been reading his stuff in English over the last year, or listening or following what's been happening at the Politician. I mean, there was a conference there this summer where the prime guests were Anne Applebaum,
Snyder and
Tim Snyder,
and Marcy
Sikorsky. So much for the Radical Project. And very much tied in with very much sort of prompting that, I think, is precisely this desire to use history and historical justice as the mode for making a claim toward democracy.
No, I think that's a really nice point, how you put that instability in the East European and the Polish case in particular.
That was a comment.
I'm wondering, though, if, I mean, the only thing I guess I'm thinking about it. I mean, it's a really interesting point. The only thing I think we have to be a little bit careful about is you also have, in the German case, very strong narratives of victimization as well. So, 500,000 Germans who were killed during the fire bombings. And the expulsions, right? So I mean, I appreciate very much. I think in the Polish case, the instability is even perhaps sharper, but I think it also is there in the German case. Yeah. One other question. Yeah. Go ahead, Anna.
Because even the way you have the program being presented in Poland, they're usually instigated by the Nazi president.
Right. Well, of course, yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
To me,
Yeah,
it
go ahead.
goes back to this issue of mythology and to what you were saying
Yeah.
in the U.S. and why actually in the U.S. even the left buys into the fact that this is the greatest country on earth and that everyone has a chance. This is a very powerful narrative that therefore dampens critical examination.
Yeah.
And the fact that Obama is elected, on the one hand, it's true that you would not see a black person being elected as president of France. Impossible, right? In the U.S., it's possible. On the other hand, so people cling to this myth of the exceptional, and therefore it's more difficult, given that myth, to really scratch and understand the past. And in Poland, the myth is more powerful than in Germany.
Yes, I agree.
Because there's a counter. In Germany.
Yeah, of course.
The other side is so much more powerful than their
Yes.
victimhood.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And in Poland, victimhood is so powerful that it's always against the grain.
No, I agree completely. Yeah.
And although
Yeah.
even if the state is involved in
Yeah.
all of these memory projects by funding not only TED, but the new
Yeah,
museum
sure.
and all sorts of Holocaust educational programs at all sorts of levels, it is still, I would say, it's pushed by the left. And the state is also driven to do that to represent itself to the world, right?
Mhm.
And then the state is doing that also as a way, you know, it's aligning
Mhm,
itself with Israel and with
Yeah.
the U.S. in order to carve a special position within the EU.
Making
But-
sure that the context, the historical context is understood, right?
Yes, but
That's
I
the
mean,
thing here.
it is. I agree with you. I mean,
Mm.
it is a project that's driven by the left
Mhm.
in Poland.
Yeah.
And to me, an additional paradox to what
Yeah.
you pointed is that in a homogeneous society like Poland, where 95%, you know, people
Mm.
are ethnically Polish, whatever that means, and Catholic at least nominally, if you want to create that democratic, multicultural, liberal state, you need to have others.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And then the tension and the paradox is that you need to keep those others other.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way to build anything
Yeah.
but by keeping the Jew as a Jew.
Uh-huh, yeah. Uh-huh.
And that's
Mhm.
that's the
Yeah.
actually the tragedy of the project, to my sense, is that you need to keep the others, other.
That's a good point, yeah. Well, I agree with everything you got to say.
Eva,
I have one, oh, yeah, go ahead, ask a question.
I just wanted to add something. Hungary has a very, very small,
See you later.
but very audible and very visible memory activist group
Okay.
since early this year. They are present on Freedom Square, and they are fighting to try to be there, but their opposition is so much stronger.
Right, right.
Today was the day when they made illegal a particular group, a nationalist group, but they made it illegal. Not this group, but something else. The National Guard, outcome of the National Guard. But all they have to do, so it's illegal by the state, but all they have to do is add a word like the old or the new, and they are back to legality again. So the memory activists are very admirable, very small groups,
Yeah.
sometimes 30, sometimes 300, not very large.
Yeah.
We are there on Freedom Square. Sorry,
Yeah.
but
No, thank you
culture.
for, and I just briefly, I mean, I agree with it. I mean, in the Polish case, the resistance is much stronger. And in this sense, I actually think there's a strong similarity of Poland and the United States. This is a very patriotic country. And Poland also has a very strong form of patriotism that makes, I mean, basically you start, I mean, I have a colleague in my department. She teaches Latin American history. In her first semester, she was coming from Berkeley to South Carolina. And her first semester, she was teaching Latin American history in the 20th century, which is, you know, doesn't necessarily shine a good picture on the United States. And two guys just stood up and said, "You're anti-American. This is bullshit." You know, and now since then she's had different kinds of experiences. I don't want to make my university out to be what, but I just give it as an example that, I mean, that's, you know, like if she was attacking the nation, that it was this emotional, sacred object that she was challenging when she was saying that, you know, look, there's, so, I don't know if others would, but yeah, real,
I'm wondering, in thinking of the United States, is the issue of reparations.
yeah,
You know, how that enters into it, and
yeah,
your discussion of, you know, the instability in Poland, and
Right.
the sense of social justice. What about financial justice?
Yeah.
I mean, how does that,
in the U.S. case,
well, in the U.S. and also
Yeah.
in Germany and Poland, I mean, does that enter into it at all? If you have
Yeah.
a admission of guilt, therefore
Yeah.
now we have to pay.
yeah. In the Polish case, they are still undergoing the process of returning Jewish communal property. Jewish individual property is a whole nother, because of, I think the biggest fear there, well, I mean, there's multiple, but I think one of the concerns is that you have the expulsion of Germans. You have 8 million Germans who are expelled, and that will then perhaps activate those claims. The U.S. case and oh my, I'd have to really think about that, but I don't,
But I think it
yeah,
complicates
yeah, of
things.
course it does. Yeah, yeah. Thanks very much for
Thank you
the
very
question.
much for coming.